Survival is usually a primal instinct, a ruthless, selfish math equation where you do whatever it takes to stay breathing. But what happens when the line between life and a brutally agonizing death comes down to a single, paper-thin sheet of winter ice? Picture this: you've just pulled off the impossible, slipping through the fingers of the very monsters who want to burn you alive. You are free, swallowed by the pitch-black cover of the night, your pursuer drowning in freezing water behind you. All you have to do is keep running into the dark, and you get to live. But instead, you stop, you turn around, and you reach out a hand to save the man who was just hunting you down like an animal. It's an act of ultimate blinding compassion, and it's going to cost you your life in the most horrifying way imaginable. Tonight, we're looking at a jailbreak so psychologically twisted and heartbreaking that it completely defies human nature, proving that sometimes your own humanity is the exact thing that seals your death warrant. If you're listening to this late at night and feeling those chills down your spine, do me a favor. Smash that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me which part scared you the most. Let's rewind the clock and set the scene. The year is 1569. We are in the Netherlands, but wipe away any idyllic images of peaceful windmills and blooming tulip fields. This was a dark, suffocating era. The region was under the absolute iron-fisted lockdown of the Spanish Empire, specifically under the command of Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, the Duke of Alba. History remembers him by a much more sinister moniker: the Butcher of Flanders. But the Duke wasn't just a military commander. He was running what essentially amounted to a state-sponsored cartel. His hitmen were heavily armed, ruthless inquisitors, and his primary business was wiping out anyone who didn't strictly conform to the state-mandated Catholic religion. This was a true surveillance state, centuries before wiretaps or security cameras. The streets were crawling with bounty hunters, professional thief catchers who got paid a heavy bounty per head. Paranoia was the very air these people breathed. Neighbors snitched on neighbors just to keep the heat off themselves and avoid the gallows. Trust was completely non-existent. A sudden knock on your door in the dead of night wasn't just a neighbor borrowing a cup of flour, it was the Grim Reaper with an arrest warrant. In this hyper-lethal environment, the feds were always watching, always listening, just waiting for someone to slip up. Enter our target, Dirk Willems. Dirk wasn't a serial killer. He wasn't a drug kingpin or a mob boss pulling the strings of some violent underground syndicate. He was a young man of profound faith, an Anabaptist. In today's world, his so-called crime wouldn't even register on a police scanner. His core belief was simply that individuals should consciously choose to be baptized as adults rather than having it forced upon them as infants. It sounds completely harmless to us now. But back in 1569, that specific belief was classified as high treason. It was a capital offense. Having that label slapped on you put a massive target on your back and put you on the absolute fast track to death row. The authorities didn't just want to quietly execute Anabaptists. They wanted to make gruesome, highly public spectacles out of them. They wanted to inflict maximum pain to send a chilling message to the masses. Burning at the stake was their preferred method of execution, a slow, agonizing demise meant to simulate the fires of hell. Dirk knew exactly what they did to people like him. He knew he was a highly wanted man. He had been living completely off the grid in his own hometown of Aspirin, hiding out like a fugitive, operating in the shadows. He jumped at every creaking floorboard, every distant dog bark, knowing that one single mistake, one whisper in the wrong ear, would bring the death squads kicking down his front door. And then, the inevitable finally happened. The dragnet closed in. We don't know exactly who dropped the dime on him, but in a paranoid society where blood money flowed freely, loyalty was a rare commodity that usually had a price tag. A tip-off reached the local authorities, and a heavily armed hit squad was instantly dispatched. They descended on Dirk's property with terrifying, overwhelming speed. There was no intense standoff, no Hollywood shootout. Dirk didn't even have a split second to make a run for it. 1 minute he was quietly breathing the freezing winter air, thinking he was safe, and the next, his front door was violently breached. Heavily armored men flooded his home, violently subduing him. He was slammed against the wall, bound tightly, and dragged out of his house in what amounted to a brutal 16th century perp walk. The neighbors likely peeked through their shuttered windows, terrified, watching as Dirk was hauled away, knowing exactly the gruesome fate that awaited him. Instead, the authorities didn't just toss him into some low-security local holding cell, they hauled him directly over to a heavily fortified structure right in the heart of Aspirin. This wasn't a standard jail, it was an imposing, stone-cold fortress that had been repurposed into a medieval black site for high-value targets. The walls were impossibly thick, the windows barred with heavy iron, and the guards were armed to the teeth. It was the kind of maximum security facility you simply did not walk out of alive. As the heavily armed guards marched Dirk down the freezing, damp corridors, the reality of his situation began to crush him. They shoved him into a pitch-black cell. The heavy wooden door slammed shut with a deafening thud that echoed through the stone hallways, followed by the terrifying, metallic grinding of heavy deadbolts sliding into place. In that chilling moment, surrounded by absolute darkness and the stench of despair, Dirk Willems was officially a dead man walking. He was locked down tight, buried alive inside a fortress of stone. The countdown to the stake had officially begun, and as far as the world was concerned, Dirk's fate was sealed. But the feds were about to learn that when a man is backed into a corner with absolutely nothing left to lose, the human will to survive can engineer the impossible. The facility they dragged Dirk into wasn't originally designed to be a prison. It was the Aspirin Castle, a once grand structure that the authorities had brutally retrofitted into a medieval supermax. To the outside world, its towering stone walls might have looked like a symbol of aristocratic power. But to the unlucky souls dragged through its heavy iron gates, it was known as something else entirely. It was a black site, a palace of bones. This was the end of the line, a desolate holding facility where the state's most hated enemies were essentially warehoused until it was time to slaughter them. When that heavy wooden door slammed shut, sealing Dirk inside his pitch-black cell, it wasn't just a lockdown. It was a burial. The conditions inside this dungeon were engineered to break a human being down to their absolute lowest psychological and physical baseline. There was no heating, no natural light, and absolutely no mercy. The stone walls permanently sweated freezing, stagnant water, and the air was thick with the suffocating stench of rot, human waste, and unadulterated fear. Dirk was shoved into what amounted to extreme solitary confinement. In the modern prison system, even the hardest criminals start losing their grip on reality after a few weeks in the hole. Dirk was plunged into that psychological abyss on day one. The mental torture of being trapped in that freezing dark was relentless. There were no clocks, no windows to track the sun. Time warped into one continuous, agonizing night. But the absolute worst part wasn't the silence. It was the sounds. During the dead of night, the heavy stone corridors would echo with the muffled, agonizing screams of other inmates being interrogated by the inquisitors. Every time heavy leather boots came echoing down the corridor, Dirk's heart would violently slam against his ribs. Was it the guards coming to feed him, or was it the executioner coming to drag him to the stake? Living in that constant, suffocating state of hypervigilance was a psychological meat grinder. It was death row in the 16th century. There were no appeals, no fancy lawyers, and no final meals. Just a terrifying waiting room for the fire. But the authorities didn't just wage war on Dirk's mind. They systematically destroyed his body. The state-mandated diet for a condemned Anabaptist was nothing short of a starvation protocol. He was tossed literal scraps, moldy, rock-hard pieces of crust and foul, contaminated water that barely kept his organs functioning. As the brutal weeks dragged on, Dirk began to physically waste away. His body, desperate for fuel in the freezing temperatures, began to cannibalize its own muscle mass. He lost a staggering amount of weight. The vibrant young man who had been arrested just weeks prior was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out, emaciated shell. His cheekbones jutted out of his pale face, and his clothes hung off his shrinking frame like rags on a scarecrow. He was slowly becoming a living ghost. The guards who sneered through the iron bars likely thought they were looking at a broken man, a pathetic creature too weak to even stand straight, let alone pose a security threat. But here is the most brilliant, yet twisted irony of this entire true crime saga. By starving him to the absolute brink of death, his captors were unknowingly handing him the ultimate key to his survival. They were stripping away the weight that would have doomed him. The feds thought they were crushing his spirit, but they were actually forging the exact physical profile he would desperately need to pull off the impossible just a few weeks down the line. As his body withered, something inside Dirk's mind snapped into absolute razor-sharp focus. The primal, undeniable instinct to survive overrode the religious resignation of his fate. He knew the execution order was creeping closer. He could practically smell the smoke. If he stayed in that cell, he was going to burn. He had to break out. But how do you escape a heavily guarded, fortified stone castle when you have absolutely nothing? You use what they give you. Dirk began meticulously scanning his desolate environment. His eyes adjusted to the suffocating gloom, hunting for any exploit, any weakness in the system. His target? The small barred window high up on his cell wall, the only source of fresh air in the entire tomb. But getting to it and getting down the massive stone exterior required a rope, and Dirk had no tools, no outside smugglers, and no contraband. So he decided to make his own. With painful, freezing fingers, Dirk began quietly tearing apart the only possessions he had left. He started with the filthy, lice-ridden blanket they had thrown at him. When that wasn't enough, he moved on to his own clothes. Tearing them into long, jagged strips, he sat in the suffocating darkness of his cell. They'd listening intently for the footsteps of the guards and began to twist and braid the scraps of fabric together. This was painstaking, excruciating work. Every knot he tied had to be perfectly tight. A single weak point meant he would plummet to his death on the jagged rocks below. The paranoia was absolute. If a guard peered through the peephole during a random cell check and caught him weaving a makeshift rope, the punishment would be immediate and severe. They would likely chain him to the floor until the day of his execution. Whenever he heard the terrifying sound of boots echoing down the hall, Dirk would frantically scramble to hide his crude lifeline, burying it deep beneath the putrid straw he used for a bed, lying on top of it and feigning sleep while his heart hammered in his throat. Night after night, in complete secrecy, the rope grew. Inch by inch, foot by foot, Dirk Willems wove his desperation, his fear, and his sheer will to live into a knotted, fraying lifeline. It was an incredibly desperate plan, built on impossible odds and shredded rags. But as the bitter winter raged outside, freezing the moat that surrounded the castle, Dirk tied the final knot. He looked up at the barred window. The stage was set. It was time to roll the dice. The night Dirk Willems decided to execute his plan, the weather was brutally unforgiving. It was late winter in 1569, and a savage chill had settled over Aspirin, the kind of cold that sinks deep into your marrow and makes the very air hurt to breathe. The massive stone walls of the castle offered no insulation. Inside his cell, Dirk could see his own breath pluming in the pitch black. Outside, the world was dead quiet, save for the howling wind violently whipping against the castle's exterior. It was the perfect auditory cover for a jailbreak. Dirk pulled the crude, makeshift rope from its hiding place beneath his filthy straw bed. He ran his bruised, trembling hands over the twisted knots of torn blankets and shredded clothing. It felt terrifyingly flimsy. This wasn't some heavy-duty tactical paracord. It was a desperate amalgamation of rags. He knew realistically that the odds of this makeshift lifeline holding his weight without snapping were razor-thin. But he also knew the alternative was a slow, agonizing death at the stake. He had to take the drop. Moving with absolute silence, Dirk dragged his emaciated body toward the small grated window set high up in the thick stone wall. The heavy iron bars were his first massive obstacle. Historical accounts are somewhat vague on exactly how he bypassed them, whether he painstakingly chipped away at the crumbling mortar over weeks, or whether his starvation diet had left him so shockingly thin that he could simply squeeze his skeletal frame through a gap that the guards assumed was secure. Either way, the impossible was happening. Dirk was breaching the perimeter. He secured one end of his ragged rope to the sturdiest anchor point he could find near the window ledge. He tugged on it, testing the tension. It held, but it groaned under the strain. There was no time to second guess. The longer he hesitated, the higher the risk of a guard doing a random cell check and catching him red-handed. Dirk hoisted himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. The wind immediately blasted his face as he forced his upper body through the narrow opening. Below him lay a sheer, terrifying drop into the abyss. At the bottom of the castle wall was the town's defensive moat, known locally as the Hondagat, or the Dog's Hole. It was a deep, treacherous trench of water designed to drown anyone trying to siege the castle or break out of it. Gritting his teeth, Dirk grabbed the knotted rags, swung his legs out, and committed. He was out of the cell. He was hanging suspended in the freezing night air, completely exposed. The descent was agonizing. The rough stone exterior of the castle aggressively scraped against his skin, tearing his hands and bruising his joints. His grip was dangerously weak, his fingers numb from the biting frost. Every time he lowered himself past another knot, the makeshift rope ominously creaked and stretched. The fabric was groaning, fibers popping under the strain of his weight. Dirk didn't dare look down. He just kept his eyes glued to the stone, hyper-focused on moving hand over hand, praying his crude engineering would hold together for just a few more seconds. And then, disaster struck. He was still several feet above the ground when he ran out of rope. He was hanging dead in the air, his muscles burning with lactic acid, unable to climb back up and too high to drop safely. He had miscalculated the length. The panic must have been blinding. He held on for as long as his starved, exhausted body could manage, but his grip finally failed. Dirk let go, plummeting the remaining distance into the freezing dark. He hit the ground hard. The impact sent a violent shockwave up his legs, but miraculously, nothing snapped. He had landed right on the edge of the Hondagat. Dirk lay in the dirt for a frantic, breathless second, waiting for the alarm bells to ring. Nothing happened. The wind continued to howl, masking the sound of his rough landing. He scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribcage. He was outside the walls. He had actually broken out of the supermax. But the nightmare was far from over. Before him lay the Hondagat. The moat was frozen solid, encased in a layer of winter ice. However, the worst possible thing was happening. The weather had recently begun to break. A slight thaw had started to set in over the past few days, meaning the thick structural integrity of the ice was heavily compromised. It was no longer a solid bridge. It was a deadly, unpredictable trap. Dirk didn't have the luxury of cautiously testing the ice. He had to cross it right now, before the guards realized his cell was empty. He took his first terrified step onto the frozen moat. Suddenly, a sharp, authoritative shout violently shattered the silence of the night. "Halt!" Dirk's blood ran ice cold. He whipped his head around. A heavily armed guard, a professional thief catcher, had spotted him. The guard had either been patrolling the perimeter or had looked out a window at the exact wrong moment. The cover was blown. The feds were officially on him. The thief catcher didn't hesitate. He drew his weapon, blew the alarm, and began sprinting full tilt toward Dirk. The manhunt had instantaneously gone from 0 to 100. Panic exploded in Dirk's chest. The guard was well-fed, highly trained, and moving fast. Dirk was severely malnourished, exhausted, and standing on the edge of a melting, frozen moat. He had no weapons and nowhere to hide. His only option was straight ahead, Without looking back, Dirk Willems hurled himself directly onto the treacherous, cracking ice of the Hondegat, sprinting blindly into the dark, with a heavily armed killer right on his heels. The chase was on. This is the moment where true crime usually turns into a violent, chaotic scramble. The adrenaline dump is massive. You have two men locked in a high-stakes, life-or-death sprint over the most unstable surface imaginable. Dirk Willems is running entirely on fumes and raw terror. He hits the surface of the frozen Hondegat, his feet slipping and sliding in the darkness. The wind is roaring in his ears, but it's entirely drowned out by the heavy, terrifying thud of the thief-catcher's boots pounding the frozen earth behind him, closing the distance rapidly. The moat wasn't incredibly wide, but when you are navigating a minefield of melting ice in the pitch black, every single step feels like a mile. Dirk's eyes frantically scanned the pale moonlit surface ahead of him, searching for patches that looked solid, and desperately trying to avoid areas where the dark, freezing water pooled on top. Here is where the brutal cruelty of the state's starvation diet suddenly became Dirk's greatest tactical advantage. Because he had been starved down to practically skin and bones, he was incredibly light. His emaciated frame barely exerted any pressure on the fragile surface. He was practically gliding, stepping rapidly, distributing his meager weight just enough to keep the ice from giving way beneath his boots. The surface groaned ominously beneath him, a low, terrifying rumble that signaled imminent collapse. But it held. It actually held. Dirk was moving fast, propelled by the sheer, unadulterated instinct to avoid the stake. Behind him, the thief-catcher was completely blinded by the thrill of the chase. Or as this guard wasn't thinking about physics or the structural integrity of a late winter thaw. He was thinking about the massive bounty on Dirk's head. He was thinking about the heavy bag of silver he'd collect for dragging this high-value fugitive back to the Inquisitors. The guard was well-fed, heavily muscled, and weighed down by thick winter clothing, leather armor, and heavy weapons. He was a human wrecking ball barreling toward a glass floor. Dirk was nearly at the opposite bank. The tree line, the promise of total freedom, and the dark, sheltering cover of the forest was right there. He could see the jagged silhouettes of the branches against the night sky. Just a few more frantic steps. He didn't dare look over his shoulder. He could hear the guard shouting, a vicious, aggressive roar meant to terrify him into slowing down. But Dirk kept pushing. He leaped the final few feet, his boots hitting the solid, frozen dirt of the far bank. He scrambled up the slight incline, gasping for air, his lungs burning like they were filled with crushed glass. He had made it. He had successfully crossed the Hondegat. The feds had lost their geographical advantage. All he had to do was plunge into the thick woods and he would vanish like a ghost. He would be untraceable. But as Dirk stood on the bank, a sound ripped through the night that made his blood freeze faster than the winter air. Crack! It wasn't a small snap. It was a deafening, explosive fracture that sounded like a gunshot echoing across the empty fields. The sound was instantly followed by a violent, chaotic splash. Dirk stopped dead in his tracks. He turned around, peering back across the expanse of the moat. The thief-catcher had charged recklessly onto the middle of the ice, but his heavy boots, his armor, and his well-fed bulk had been too much for the thawing surface to bear. The ice hadn't just cracked. It had completely surrendered beneath him. The guard had plunged straight through a massive fissure, dropping like a stone into the pitch-black, freezing water of the Hondegat. Instantly, the situation devolved into pure, unadulterated horror. The water in the moat wasn't just cold, it was lethal. It was the kind of cold that violently seizes your muscles, knocks the wind completely out of your lungs, and sends your heart into immediate spasming shock. The guard's heavy winter clothing, the very thing keeping him warm moments ago, instantly absorbed the freezing water, turning into a massive, a weighted anchor dragging him down into the dark abyss. He broke the surface, thrashing wildly, his hands desperately clawing at the jagged edges of the broken ice. But the ice was slick and brittle. Every time he tried to hoist his heavy waterlogged body up, the edge would simply snap off, plunging him back into the freezing depths. The aggressive, terrifying predator who had been hunting Dirk just seconds ago was entirely gone. In his place was a terrified, drowning man, screaming into the void. "Help! Help me! I'm drowning!" His voice was shrill, desperate, and completely raw. It wasn't an authoritative command, it was the pathetic, agonizing plea of a man who realized he was seconds away from dying in the dark. The freezing water was rapidly sapping his strength. His thrashing was slowing down. Hypothermia was setting in with terrifying speed. Dirk stood on the safe, solid ground of the far bank, perfectly concealed in the shadows. He watched the man who wanted to burn him alive struggle against the inevitable. The night was dead silent again, save for the horrific, gurgling splashes and the desperate cries for mercy echoing off the stone walls of the castle. This was the defining moment. This was the exact second where human nature dictates you turn your back and run. The universe had just handed Dirk Willems the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. His pursuer was neutralizing himself. No one else was around. No one else had seen him cross. The path to freedom was completely clear, and his enemy was conveniently sinking to the bottom of a frozen trench. All Dirk had to do was walk away. Just turn around. I'd take one step into the forest, and the nightmare would be over. The feds would pull a frozen corpse out of the moat the next morning, and Dirk would be long gone, starting a new life. But Dirk Willems didn't run. He stood frozen on the bank, listening to the screams of his executioner, and in that agonizing, breathless silence, his mind began to wage a terrifying war against itself. Let's hit the pause button right here and really break down the psychology of this moment, because it is the absolute crux of this entire true crime nightmare. Put yourself in Dirk's shoes for just a second. You are standing on the edge of a frozen moat in the dead of night. You are starving, freezing, and exhausted to the point of collapse. Behind you is the deep, dark woods, absolute freedom. In front of you is a man thrashing in violently cold water, screaming for his life. But this isn't just a random stranger. This is a state-sanctioned hitman. This is the guy whose literal job description is to drag you back to a dungeon so you can be tied to a wooden pole and set on fire. If Dirk walks away, he lives. The guard dies. It's the ultimate karma. It's survival of the fittest playing out in real time. In the harsh, brutal math of 16th century Europe, nobody would blame Dirk for turning his back. The guards wouldn't have shown him an ounce of mercy if the roles were reversed. In fact, they would have laughed as he drowned. But Dirk Willems wasn't calculating odds, and he wasn't looking at this through the lens of a fugitive. He was looking at it through the lens of his deep, unwavering Anabaptist faith. A core tenet of his belief system was absolute pacifism and radical compassion. The idea that you must love your enemies, even the ones actively trying to murder you. It's a beautiful philosophy in a Sunday sermon, but applying it at 2 a.m. on the edge of a frozen, deadly moat requires a level of psychological fortitude that borders on the supernatural. Dirk watched the guard's head dip below the freezing water. The man was running out of time. The heavy waterlogged clothing was winning the battle. The splashing was growing weaker, the cries for help turning into desperate, suffocated gurgles. What if? What if Dirk just waited 3 more minutes? What if he just let nature take its course? He wouldn't even have to kill the man himself. The freezing water was doing the dirty work for him. His hands would technically be clean, but Dirk couldn't do it. The agonizing screams of the dying man cut through the frigid air, piercing right through Dirk's survival instinct. In a move that completely defies human logic and self-preservation, Dirk Willems made a decision that would violently alter the course of history. He didn't run into the woods. He turned around. Dirk stepped back onto the deadly, compromised ice. He was walking straight back toward the epicenter of danger, she voluntarily abandoning his hard-won freedom. This wasn't a reckless charge. He had to move with agonizing precision. He knew exactly how fragile the surface was. He dropped to his hands and knees, spreading his emaciated body weight as wide as possible, crawling like a ghost across the terrifyingly thin ice, moving slowly back toward the jagged, gaping black hole where the guard had fallen through. The ice groaned loudly in protest beneath him, threatening to send them both to a watery grave. The freezing wind whipped at his face, but Dirk pushed forward until he reached the very edge of the fracture. He looked down into the black water. The guard was barely conscious, his face pale and blue, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. He was sinking. Dirk didn't hesitate. He reached out his bare, freezing hands, was extending them over the jagged lip of the ice, right into the freezing water. He grabbed the heavy, sodden collar of the guard's thick winter coat. The physical toll of this moment is almost unimaginable. Dirk was a starved, emaciated prisoner who had just burned his last reserves of energy, escaping a supermax and sprinting across a frozen moat. He had virtually no muscle mass left. Now, he was trying to deadlift a fully grown, heavily muscled man wearing 50 pounds of waterlogged armor and wool out of a freezing trench. It was a terrifying tug-of-war against gravity and death. Dirk strained with every fiber of his being. His muscles screamed, his joints popped, and the ice beneath him ominously cracked further, threatening to dump them both. He dug the toes of his boots into the slippery surface, anchored himself, and pulled with a desperate, guttural roar. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive bulk of the guard crested the edge of the broken ice. Dirk heaved backward, dragging the freezing, gasping man onto the solid, unbroken surface of the moat. They both collapsed onto the ice, chest heaving, lungs burning. The guard was shivering violently, coughing up black water, completely incapacitated by the shock of the cold. Dirk lay beside him, completely spent, his body utterly drained. For a few heavy, breathless seconds, the two enemies simply lay there in the dark. The hunter and the hunted, brought together by an insane act of grace. The guard looked at Dirk. He knew exactly what had just happened. The man he was ordered to hunt down and burn alive had just risked his own life to pull him out of the grave. In that quiet, chilling moment, the dynamic completely shifted. The guard's allegiance to the crown, the bounty on Dirk's head, the strict orders of the Inquisitors, none of it mattered. Dirk had given him his life back. The unspoken agreement hung in the air. You saved me. Now I let you walk. The guard slowly pushed himself up, trembling violently. He looked at Dirk, his eyes silently communicating his gratitude. He was going to let Dirk go. He was going to look the other way and let the fugitive disappear into the night. It was the ultimate redemptive climax to a horrifying night. But true crime rarely ends with a clean Hollywood redemption. Right as Dirk began to push himself to his feet, preparing to finally make his escape into the tree line, a heavy, booming voice suddenly shattered the silence from the far side of the moat. The feds weren't done playing. The nightmare was just entering its most twisted phase. The booming voice didn't come from another random foot soldier. It came from the absolute top of the local food chain. Standing on the opposite bank, safely wrapped in heavy furs and perfectly dry, was the burgomaster, the mayor of Aspirin himself. He hadn't just stumbled upon the scene. He had likely been roused by the initial alarm, had rushed out to the perimeter, and had been standing there in the freezing dark, watching the entire unbelievable saga play out in total silence. He had watched the guard fall through the ice. He had watched Dirk turn back. And he had watched the fugitive pull the state's enforcer from the jaws of death. But the burgomaster wasn't moved by this miraculous display of human compassion. He didn't see an act of divine grace. He saw a high-value target trying to slip the net, and an employee failing to do his job. To the state, Dirk Willems wasn't a hero. He was a piece of state property scheduled for demolition, and the burgomaster was entirely focused on the bottom line. Seize him! The mayor's voice cut through the freezing air like a whip. The guard, still violently shivering on the ice next to Dirk, froze. He looked across the moat at his superior, then slowly turned his head to look at the emaciated, exhausted man who had just saved his life. The hesitation in the guard's eyes was profound. He knew exactly what seizing Dirk meant. It meant condemning his savior to the most agonizing, horrific death imaginable. His conscience was screaming at him to let the man run. But the burgomaster wasn't going to let a crisis of conscience interrupt state business. Mis Rosidig. He saw the guard's hesitation and immediately escalated the situation. He didn't appeal to the guard's sense of duty. He appealed to his sense of terror. The mayor shouted across the ice, a vicious, chilling threat that invoked the absolute authority of the Spanish Inquisition. He essentially told the guard, "If you let that prisoner take one more step toward the forest, you will be stripped of your rank, charged with treason, and I will personally see to it that you are dragged to the stake and burned in his place." In that one agonizing sentence, the burgomaster had completely trapped the guard in an impossible psychological vice. It was the ultimate ultimatum. Save your conscience and die a horrific, agonizing death, or save your own skin and condemn the man who just pulled you out of the freezing water. This is where the darkest, most cowardly aspect of human nature rears its ugly head. When forced to choose between abstract moral integrity and immediate self-preservation, the survival instinct almost always wins. The fear of the state, the terror of the Inquisition, and the horrifying image of his own flesh burning at the stake broke the guard's resolve entirely. The profound gratitude that had been in his eyes just seconds ago vanished, completely replaced by cold, hard panic. Slowly, heavily, the guard dragged himself to his feet. Dirk didn't run. He didn't fight back. He was completely exhausted, completely drained. He just looked at the man he had saved. The guard reached out, the very hands that Dirk had just grabbed to pull him from the freezing water, and violently grabbed Dirk by his tattered, freezing collar. The ultimate betrayal was complete. When Dirk was roughly shoved across the ice, marched back across the very moat he had just risked everything to cross. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, but the psychological devastation of that moment must have been absolutely soul-crushing. He had won. He had beaten the system. He had freedom right in the palm of his hand, and he had thrown it away for a man who had immediately stabbed him in the back. This time, the authorities weren't going to take any chances. They didn't drag Dirk back to the makeshift cell in the castle. They knew he was resourceful, and they knew he had nothing left to lose. They needed a facility that was absolutely, mathematically inescapable. They hauled him through the dark streets of Aspirin and threw him into the secure holding room at the top of the heavily fortified church tower. Yes, this was a completely different beast than his previous cell. There were no barred windows to squeeze through, no fraying blankets to turn into ropes. The door was made of massive, solid oak, secured from the outside by heavy iron deadbolts. Armed guards were stationed right outside the door, rotating on an aggressive 24/7 watch schedule. They essentially locked him in a vault. It was a total, absolute lockdown. Dirk sat on the cold stone floor of the church tower, listening to the heavy boots of the guards pacing outside his door. The adrenaline of the night had completely evaporated, leaving him hollow, freezing, and utterly defeated. The escape was over. The feds had won. There would be no more midnight heroics, no more desperate sprints across cracking ice. The system had closed its jaws around him. And this time, there was absolutely no way out. The countdown to the stake had resumed, and the executioners were already gathering the wood. The true crime saga of Dirk Willems doesn't end with a clean cut to black. It ends in a horrific, drawn-out spectacle of state-sanctioned violence that remains one of the most haunting executions in recorded history. The date was set, May 16, 1569. The winter thaw had finally given way to spring, but the atmosphere in Aspirin was colder and more suffocating than ever. On the day of his execution, Dirk was dragged from the heavily fortified church tower. He was physically shattered, a walking skeleton, his body broken by months of starvation, freezing temperatures, and the brutal psychological toll of his ultimate betrayal. But historical accounts note that his spirit was terrifyingly calm. He had made his peace with the horrific reality of what was about to happen. The authorities had set up the execution site on the outskirts of town. A massive, heavy wooden stake had been driven deep into the ground, surrounded by thick piles of highly combustible dry wood and straw. The entire town was essentially forced to attend. The inquisitors wanted maximum visibility. They needed the citizens of Aspirin to see exactly what happens to those who defy the state. The message was clear. There are no second chances, no successful escapes, and no mercy. Dirk was roughly shoved toward the pyre. The executioners stripped him down and bound his emaciated wrists and ankles tightly to the heavy wooden post with thick, abrasive ropes. The smell of raw, dry timber and the sharp chemical stench of accelerants filled the air. A high-ranking official, the local bailiff, sat rigidly on his horse a few yards away, overseeing the grim proceedings to ensure the state's brutal will was carried out to the letter. At his command, the executioner stepped forward with a blazing torch and thrust it into the dry brush at the base of the stake. The fire caught instantly. The flames aggressively roared to life, eagerly crawling up the massive pile of wood, hungry for flesh. The heat was immediate and punishing. The crowd fell into a terrified dead silence, waiting for the inevitable agonizing screams. But then something incredibly bizarre and deeply disturbing happened. Call it a freak meteorological anomaly, or call it a cruel twist of fate, but right as the flames began to climb toward Dirk's torso, a powerful, erratic wind suddenly whipped across the execution grounds. The heavy gale forcefully blew the roaring flames sharply to the side, like pushing the core of the fire away from Dirk's upper body. In a standard execution by burning, the victim usually dies relatively quickly from a combination of the intense heat, extreme shock, and, most importantly, asphyxiation from inhaling the thick, toxic smoke. It is a horrific death, but it is usually a fast one. The erratic wind robbed Dirk of that morbid mercy. The fierce gusts forcefully blew the suffocating smoke entirely away from his face, allowing him to continue breathing fresh air, while the flames were pushed down, aggressively torching only his lower extremities. The fire became a slow, horrific meat grinder. It was methodically burning his legs and lower torso to ash while keeping him completely conscious and horribly alive. This wasn't an execution anymore. It was an agonizing, prolonged torture session. The pain was beyond human comprehension. Dirk, bound tightly to the stake, could not escape the searing heat. As the flames slowly consumed his lower half, the silence of the crowd was violently shattered by his screams. Historical records chillingly note that Dirk's agony was so prolonged, so intensely horrific, that he cried out, "Oh Lord, my God," over 70 separate times. His voice echoed across the open fields, a haunting, desperate plea for a death that simply refused to come. The spectacle became so intensely gruesome, so deeply sickening, that even the hardened authorities began to crack. The crowd was horrified. This wasn't justice. This was butchery. The bailiff, sitting on his horse, watched the prolonged, agonizing torment. This was a man whose entire job was to oversee brutal executions for the state. He was a hardened enforcer of the Inquisition, accustomed to violence and suffering, but even he had his absolute limit. The relentless, agonizing screams of the man slowly roasting alive on the stake finally broke him. Unable to stomach the horrific scene any longer, the bailiff spurred his horse forward. He screamed a furious command over the roaring wind and the crackling fire, ordering the executioner to dispatch the prisoner immediately. The executioner, likely just as rattled by the horrific turn of events, scrambled to follow the order. He grabbed a heavy weapon. Historical accounts suggest it was either a large firearm or a heavy iron rod, and rushed toward the burning pyre. Through the smoke and the roaring flames, he delivered a massive, fatal blow to Dirk's head, instantly crushing his skull and finally, mercifully, ending his unimaginable suffering. The flames eventually consumed the rest of the body, leaving nothing but ash and bone. The feds had won. The state had asserted its absolute dominance. But Dirk Willems didn't just fade into the ashes of history. His story survived, passed down through generations, becoming one of the most haunting, deeply unsettling true crime narratives of the 16th century. It forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable question about the very nature of humanity. We all like to think that in a life or death situation we would make the morally superior choice. We like to think that compassion is its own reward. But Dirk Willems' story violently shatters that comfortable illusion. He pulled his worst enemy from a freezing grave, and his reward was a slow, agonizing death by fire. It leaves us with a chilling, an unanswerable question. If you were standing on the edge of that frozen moat, starving, freezing, and looking at the man who wanted to burn you alive sinking into the dark water, would you have turned back? If you made it to the end of this horrifying true crime deep dive, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and drop a comment down below, telling me honestly, what would you have done on the ice? Until next time, stay safe and always watch your back.